We're fortunate to be joined by Craig Norberg-Bohm, who's, those of you who've been involved with White Ribbon Day campaign know Craig. It was a little bit longer than 2 years, I think, that you worked on that, but it was quite a while. And Byron from This Morning, who just killed it with the keynote, right? Just like, it was amazing, just amazing. And Peter Roby, you can read their bios in here. Peter Roby, who's been a chair of the White Ribbon Day campaign, who's at Northeastern, and I've had the opportunity to interact with Peter several times recently, and it's just a great man. So thank you all for being here. The purpose of the next hour we're going to have together, as Yana said, is to unpack a little bit further about healthy masculinity. And I've heard this in the workshop as well, like this is a time for you all to practice, to engage, to get out there and really ask those questions and to take home some tools and resources. So we're going to do a super, super quick activity, which means it's after lunch. Everybody, if you just get on your feet, stand up real quick. And y'all can sit down for a minute because you're gonna show it at the end after they do it. So what we're gonna do is practice. Who does trainings or anyone on the man box? If you've been involved in White Ribbon Day. So anyone heard of the man hug? Right? So we're gonna ask you to, with permission and consent, to turn to the person next to you and to sort of practice your version of a man hug. With consent. Oh, there's some patting on the back. There's some patting on the back. Nice. Nice. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Good job. You guys, what do you see? Nice. All right, that's good. Sit down. Nice. Nice. Good job. Nice. Nice. I saw some people asking for consent. You can have your seat. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Nice. I saw some folks nicely asking for consent, right? It was nonverbal. It was like, right? It's that face like, okay? Which is not consent, just want to say. Consent must be verbal, right? It just can't be assumed. It's got to be an active yes. Okay, I'm just getting out of my trainer hat now. I saw some people doing the A-frame. Do you all want to demonstrate the A-frame?
Sure, sure.
Boom, right? Boom. Nothing in this area gets too close, right? Right? But then I saw some folks doing this super, super close. Is that a man hug?
That's the reimagining.
Oh, the reimagining. Can anyone stand up and demonstrate the reimagining man hug? What, one of you two?
The reimagine?
Yes, the reimagined man hug. Oh, oh, snaps, right? They were.
Just in terms of full disclosure, he's a husky, so it's part of the family.
Oh, nice. Okay, if you're on the same team, then that's right. There was a lot of back slapping. What's up with that? Oh, men, yeah, that's it. Okay, can you two do back slapping? Because it's a white man and a man of color, right? So. Oh, okay.
You forgot the one when you put your arm in.
I was just gonna ask for that one. It's called the dap slapping. Right? You do a dap and then you, right? What about a cross gender? What about a male-female hug? How does that look different?
Male, female?
Yeah.
Come on,
Deanna and Peter, yes. What does it look like? Oh, that was a close one. Okay. That's called the jumping hug.
That's the hurt my neck hug.
Right? Exactly. So it's just practice, just a good example of what it's like to begin to unpack masculinity, right? To begin to unpack those notions that it's not okay for men to be physical. Right? That it's not okay for men to hug, to want to be hugged, or to want to touch and be hugged. So it's continuing that dialogue around unpacking. So we're going to ask folks, and so thank you for participating in that. We're going to ask folks to just do a quick introduction. Again, we have your bio, but we want to know something a little bit more about you, about your identities, and what brings you to this work. How did you come to the work? Whatever order you prefer.
Hey! This is a welcome surprise that I'm up in front of everyone again. It's terrific. Welcome. Wonderful to be here, but it's a surprise. My remarks are entirely unprepared, so I think that's, I guess, a good thing. But I started this work because I felt lost. This is the earliest days, college. I was walking down the street and I saw a poster to a conference. Conferences are sometimes a good thing, right? And the conference poster was pen and ink, black pen and ink. Looked like a young man shivering in a cold wind. That was the pen and ink. And the title was Straight White Male Wrestling with the Master Culture. That's something. So I went to this conference and it turned my life around and I'm here now.
Oh,
So it had to do with feeling lost in these kinds of woods.
nice. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Byron Hurt. Hello again.
Hello.
My preferred pronouns are he and his. And I came into this work back in 1993 because I was asked. A lot of people often ask me, well, was there something that happened in your life that brought you to this work? Was there an event? Did you see something? Did you witness something? And the answer to that question is not exactly. I was essentially directed over to the Center of the Study of Sport and Society at Northeastern University, and I was introduced to a man by the name of Jackson Katz, who was creating a new program called the Mentors and Violence Prevention Program, and they were looking for former student athletes to be a part of this program because they felt like former student athletes had a certain level of influence and cachet and credibility, and they were looking for someone like me to begin that kind of work, educating and inspiring boys and men. And that's, quite frankly, how I got into it. I did not take any women's studies classes or gender studies classes at Northeastern. My education basically came from a lot of talks with Jackson, and if anybody knows Jackson, you know he talks a lot. But in a good way. So I learned a lot, I read a lot, and I was able to interact with a lot of feminists and pro-feminist males that really deepened my education on this subject, and I became very passionate about these issues, and I continue to do it to this day.
Thank you, Byron.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Roby. I'm currently the Director of Athletics and Recreation at Northeastern University. And like Byron, I was brought to the work because when I became the director of the Center for the Study of Sport and Society, I then became trained on facilitating around the Mentors and Violence Prevention Program. I was introduced to it, I went through the program, and then I learned how to facilitate those discussions and the awareness raisings. And we went out and did a number of those over the years with some of the colleagues that Byron had worked with over the years. So I had my awareness raised as someone that was going through the program first and foremost, and then facilitating those trainings after. One of the interesting things about my involvement with sport and society is that my children had been introduced to the programming while they were in middle school in Newton. And Jared Chin and Antoine Smith and Susan Lato, those were people that were going out to the schools facilitating those trainings for young people around diversity and conflict resolution and gender violence prevention education. So I benefited from the work because my children were exposed to it, and then I got exposed to it and I benefited from the work and became committed to wanting to do what I could to be part of the solution. And so I've been on that road ever since.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So those of you educators who think that, hey, my work doesn't make a whole lot of difference, I'm just out there in the schools every day, as you can see, sometimes your work can really influence a movement by introducing someone who has the power to make huge changes to the work you're doing. So keep up your great work. So we've heard some today that this is not a new epidemic, sexual violence, what's going on in the news, what's being in the popular kind of culture. So if it's not new, what is new? What is new about what's happening now?
Are you thinking about sexual harassment charges and bringing some powerful men down? That's new. I mean, there's the quick response, the saying zero tolerance is a context we haven't had for very long. You know, we've seen it in some other places. some other colleges in some contexts, but they were unique, special, but surprising events. This is a watershed that is one after the other, and the response has been very remarkable. And I think I'd like that we all there's some credit there. I'm not sure we're all entirely happy with the processes, but that it's a new process I think there's value in, and it's a voice of survivor that's doing that, right? In a way, being listened to in a new way. That's what I feel.
What do you think about that, Byron?
Well, I agree with Craig, and I think that there are brave new voices, as I mentioned earlier, who are basically standing on the shoulders of women and other victims and survivors who came before them, who paved the way, and who created, I guess, a changing culture where victims of gender-based violence have the space to come forward in a way in which they are not, at this moment being retaliated against, although there has been retaliation, as we are learning, by men in power who are striking back against women and trying to silence their voices. But the lack of fear of that male power, I think, is something that's a little bit new. And something that's new-ish, I would say, are the growing number of young men and men who are really actively trying to be allies with girls and women, and people with various identities. And I think that that's something that I'm seeing as I travel around the country. When I first started doing this work, I was the first person hired by Jackson Katz. I didn't know many men who did this kind of work, and when Jackson and I would go to conferences like this, and even when I would go to conferences like this, the room would be, like, I would say 98 to 99% women. The fact that there are so many men in this room, I think, is extraordinary and should be noted. So I see progress there as well.
Right, good point, good point.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's changed is the curtain's been pulled back, and people are being held accountable. And the public sentiment is now favoring the victim. Whereas before, there was always some question as to whether there was valid charges and, what kind of axe did they have to grind. Well, there's no axe to grind. It's about, having your voice be heard and speaking truth to power. And so for the first time, in my view, this is a watershed moment in our history, that people are not going to be able to hide behind power and influence anymore to perpetuate these kinds of horrific acts on folks that are less powerful and less influential, and it's about time.
Before you leave the mic, does race, privilege, power have anything to do? Oh, sorry.
Here, I'll do that.
No, it's okay. I'll use this. It's good. It's fine. Just a quick question, a follow-up question. Does race, power, privilege have anything to do with what's new now?
Well, power and privilege, for sure. Why would anybody feel like they have the right to sexually assault somebody or proposition them because they can? Where does that come from, that somebody, because they're running a studio, or they're a filmmaker, or they're the host of a really popular news program and they make $20 million a year, that would allow you to expose yourself to folks that have no intention, no interest in you in that way? Why would anybody feel like that's okay to risk their career and all that they've built, that they couldn't see past that, to see that person as someone with feelings, that's trying to make a way for themselves, that's trying to build a career, that has feelings and emotions that people care about? Why would you not see them as a human being, but instead just as an object for your desire? That's the heartbreaking part of all this, that's just so maddening about it. So power and influence, absolutely. Where race comes into it, I don't necessarily see it through that prism. at least in the stuff that we've been seeing more recently. Where I think race becomes more of an issue is as we start defining masculinity and all the social constructs about being a black man in society. Then it becomes very, very powerful in my view.
Thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate that. I think it's important for me to acknowledge that although women, generally speaking, based on how I understand it, as a person who identifies as male and who has lived my life as a heterosexual male, it is my understanding, based on my travels and what I've heard and learned, that generally speaking, women, regardless of race, are not typically believed when they assert that a man has sexually assaulted them, raped them, sexually harassed them, the full gamut of sexual violence. I think that's always been the case, and I think that's very problematic. I don't know, though, if we would be at this watershed moment that Craig mentioned, if the vast majority of the women who came forward to make claims against these rich and powerful men of influence, if they were women of color. I don't think that we would be at this place. And that's something that really needs to be addressed. And it's an elephant that's in the room because there is a demarcation between white women and women of color in terms of their value and who is seen as being credible versus not credible, or important versus not important. Now, I do want to say that up until recently, there are many white women who have not been believed, right? So that's true too. But it's also true that women of color are often silenced or erased the most. And that's something that I hear from the women in my life when I have conversations like this, that if, so-and-so was a woman of color, then Brett Ratner or Harvey Weinstein would not have been, quote unquote, brought down, right? I mean, even when Lupita Nyong'o, who wrote her New York Times op-ed about being, sexually assaulted by Harvey Weinstein, it didn't really even register, really, right? And she made a really scathing sort of, claim about what he did to her. So I think that those are some distinctions that we should address and that we need to actively change.
Right. Now, 1 second. And she was basically the only woman who came forward that he clapped back at, right? So the only one who he came back and made a claim to discredit her. So it's interesting that as a woman of color, she was the only one that he came back after. So do you want to add something to this, Craig?
Well, it's a real dynamic. I wanted to mention one of the outcomes that I experienced in the community. I'm curious about stories about the outcome, the kind of conversation this is generating in your own circles. But I was contacted by a temple rabbi and a congregant about facilitating a conversation among the men of the temple because they're feeling shame about Harvey Weinstein. And they're asking, are we all Harvey Weinstein? What is it? So it brought them to a conversation that they had not been before, and that the men had to talk, and they didn't know what they had to talk about. But that was positive. I'm just really glad for that. I'm wondering about those stories.
Can I just add on to that?
Yeah.
So another thing that I've noticed too is that this is one of the first times that I can remember in a very, very long time. And of course, I've only been doing this work for, a little over 20 years. And I know there may be people in this room who have done the work much longer than me. But this is one of the first times that I've seen white men being held into account at the level that we're seeing right now. Is that right or not right? I'm not sure. Because typically, what tends to happen, I think you alluded to this, Peter, is that men of color are usually the face of sexual violence, gender-based violence. And that is not to say that men of color do not rape or sexually assault or are not homophobic or transphobic. That is true. All of those things are true. But there's never been the same level of accountability in a way that transcends gender and race, male and the racial construct between white, black, and other. And so that's something that I'm also witnessing and watching it all play out in real time.
Right, good point, good point. So you talked about notions of masculinity, right? And that's why we're here unpacking that. So from your perspective, and I'm going to start down the end, back with you, Peter, how does the social construct of masculinity, the toxic aspects as well as the strengths, right, the assets, play into what's happening now in the popular culture?
Well, from all the work that we've done over the years and trying to understand what contributes to the issues around relationship violence and men's violence against women in particular, the issues around social constructs around masculinity and gender roles, and I don't think you can dismiss they're pervasive. All the images that young boys get bombarded with in the media, the relationships, how those relationships are depicted in the media, are insidious, and they accumulate over time. And so young boys grow up thinking that that's the way you're supposed to act. You know, that if you want to be viewed as a real man, then, you know, your girl's supposed to do what you tell her to do. When you're hanging out in the neighborhood and she comes by and she wants you to go with her to do something, you say, girl, I don't have time for that, because you're hanging out with your boys. Now, where does that come from? You know, that gets depicted in a lot of different ways. Maybe it's being modeled at home, but it's also being depicted in every time they view certain things. I'll give you an example. When I was at Sport and Society and doing the work, and my son Peter, who I'm really proud of, is 28 now and has done some of the things with Jane Doe over the years. He was about 13, and we were watching football on TV, and the commercial came on for Coors Light, and it was, you know, I love football on TV, and the Twins, you know, and so I said, what do you think they're trying to tell us from that ad? You know? And he said, well, what they're trying, he's 13 now, and he said that they're trying to make me think that if I drink that beer, that I'm going to get not with just one girl, but two. Like, so he understood that they were trying to play on every man's fantasy, that if you're a real man, you can handle more than one, you can handle two. And you're going to be so, you know, incredibly attractive, go figure, when you're drinking beer, that you're somehow going to have two women, you know. So that was 13 years old, and I was proud of him, because whether it was from conversations that he and his mother, my wife and I had with him, or his sister and brother, or the work that he had gone through at Sport and Society, that he had started to develop his own critical thinking skills about, you know, what relationships are supposed to be about, and why you would be attractive to somebody, and what makes for a relationship, and what makes you a man and not a man. It's not about what perfume you put on, or what car you drive, or what beer you drink. And so, you know, that's why the work that we're all doing collectively is so important, because we're trying to overcome all the images that young people get bombarded with from the time they're 3 or 4 years old. And the language that they hear, you know, do you fall down, don't cry, don't be like a girl, be a man, you know, don't throw like a girl, right? I mean, we use that language all the time. People that don't even intend to do that unintentionally are sending messages to young boys and girls about the value of being female, or identifying as a female, or being a man, being a boy, and all that comes with that. And that's the important part of the work that we have to continue to do. We have to educate young people about what this is supposed to look like.
I can't express enough how important it is to have people like Peter Roby in positions of leadership and authority. This is the athletic director at Northeastern University, and, you know, his awareness about gender issues is critical. It's critical because, you know, this is what we talk about when we talk about having male leadership sort of trickle down and have an influence on the young men and women, you know, in the athletic departments. And it's very rare for me to see an athletic director that has this level of knowledge and understanding about the social construction of masculinity. We got to give him credit for that. Can we give him a little credit for that? But it highlights what Peter just said, I think, highlights the importance of not just the training and the education, but media literacy, right? Because young boys and men are taught through media and are exposed to media at very early ages, and it's everywhere. Everywhere we look now, everyone has a media device in their hand. So media literacy is very, very important. To your question, though, what strikes me about the social construction of masculinity in my travels and in my experience is how universal that construction is. In other words, I can lead a workshop or give a talk somewhere in East New York with a group of, poor black men, and they will have the same identical social constructions of manhood and masculinity as a young white boy the same age who lives in rural Indiana, right? So the idea of what it means to be male transcends race and class and culture in ways that are phenomenal. Like, it's unbelievable. I started doing the man box exercise back at Tufts University in 1993, where I asked young men, what words would your fathers and uncles use to describe manhood or credible manhood? And all these words, come up, and they're all consistent, no matter where I go, about what it means to be male in America, heterosexual and male in America, right? And so that is like the recurring theme of masculinity that rises above everything else, and in many ways enables men from different racial backgrounds to coalesce our power, right? To basically come together. Like if you noticed, I think I showed in my clip earlier, the scene in Daytona where the young men were sexually assaulting and grabbing the women as they walked down the street. Well, later on in that same clip, there were white male police officers who didn't do anything at all. Didn't tell the young African-American men to stop doing what they were doing. They didn't arrest any of the black men for sexually assaulting the women in public, in full view of everyone. What they did was they coalesced around manhood and said, this is male space, and we're going to allow you to do male things, and we're not going to disrupt that. Right? And so, do you think that would have happened if there were black men on the street with guns and weapons, or maybe playing their music too loud, or where else can black men get away with sexually assaulting women on the street? Right? So again, the commonality, the common thread, the common experiences that we have as men often bind us together.
Yeah. Large questions. My mind draws to the job of parenting, and we're all dads. I'm cisgender, pronouns he, him, his, and I have a son who's not so sure. And so, in terms of raising a child and being with a child, and a child who is experimenting with how long is my hair, who can I talk to, how can I be, what am I allowed to be, and I think the parent's job is a remarkable opportunity in terms of turning the world around. So I know there's people here that work with parents and are particularly interested in dads, and mostly heterosexual cisgender dads is what I've seen a lot of the work be. So there's that, naming that category of the work and honoring that there's a path for those folks to walk, to meet the folks who are in another place, who are leadership, but how to live a life of your authentic self. Is that the word? How we go there, how we role model an example, but being parents and how you do that, there's a huge challenge in there. I just want to name it and talk about how we do that, about this toxic and healthy, personhood that, it's a very tricky road. It's every day, and it has to do with the tears, has to do with the challenges, decision-making, the power. It's a lot.
Yeah, it is. Thanks for making it bigger. Thanks, appreciate that, Craig.